Hamid Abdel-Samad is an Egyptian critic of Islam and bestseller author who has been living here in Germany since 1995. In June 2013, he received death threats in his home country of Egypt after having given a lecture accusing the fundamentalist Muslim Brotherhood of Islamic fascism, claiming that these tendencies originated in early Islam. The death threats were not limited to internet posts, but were also made on Egyptian television in the form of a call to all Muslims to murder Abdel-Samad. This was repeated by two other intellectuals, among them a professor at a university in Cairo. Neither the then president of Egypt nor the Egyptian justice system reacted to the threats. Abdel-Samad has received death threats here in Germany as well, and he now lives under constant police protection. Because of this, he must plan everything ahead, and he is not able to do anything spontaneously any longer. But unlike in the case of Salman Rushdie, there has been no international scandal. Obviously, death threats towards critics or satirists of Islam are no longer worth worrying about. Welcome to Germany in 2018. As a teenager growing up in an Egyptian village with a factory nearby, Abdel-Samad became a Marxist, and later as a student an Islamist joining the Muslim Brotherhood. Eventually he freed himself from always having to defend Islam, and he learned to see people as people and to speak his mind independently of who opposed his views. This he calls his own successful integration. He sees himself as an advocate for freedom and self-realization, which presupposes being allowed to make mistakes without fearing repercussions, and he believes in personal responsibility and in critical thinking. He expects others to answer with thoughts, he says, meaning arguments, not with insults or threats. Whoever rejects prejudices and demands respect must start with himself. There are only two kinds of authors in Europe who live dangerously, Abdel-Samad says. Those writing about the mafia and those criticizing Islam. But criticism of Islam is more than a human right, it's a human duty. Abdel-Samad's autobiography, originally published in 2009, will be released in an extended edition on February the 1st, 2019, and we will discuss it here on the channel. Today there is no open and honest public debate about Islam here in Germany, Abdel-Samad says. We live in a consensus society. We are striving towards reaching a consensus and closing the debate as soon as possible, rather than exploring important issues in depth, because we fear that the wrong people may take over the debate and introduce uncontrollable processes into society. Discussions about problems in Islam are being suppressed through moral blackmail. Critics are labeled inhuman, Islamophobic, right-wing populists or racial agitators. Instead of defending Western values, we adjust to the Islamists. A certain play written by Voltaire cannot be performed at theaters in Germany and in Switzerland because it's about Muhammad. Fear, naivety and indifference disguise as tolerance, and the bigger the problems become, the more we reject reality and hope that the problems will disappear all by themselves. According to Abdel-Samad, integration has failed everywhere in Europe. This becomes clear just from considering all the skepticism and anger that trying to discuss the topic gives rise to. Many migrants with an Arabic or a Turkish background feel attacked by the word integration. How are these people supposed to integrate if they don't even want to hear the word? The problems began decades ago when the Turkish workers invited by the German government to fill the gaps in the German industry after World War II were joined by their families. Fearing the sexual liberation of their children, these Turkish parents choose to isolate their families and support the building of mosques as a moral counterweight to the decadent Western society around them. The politicians were naive enough to imagine that the immigrants would change the way of life after settling in the new country. Integration has failed structurally in education and in the labor market, as well as culturally and socially, Abdel-Samad says. 90% of all immigrants who study for a practical profession in Germany do not complete their course. 43% of all people with an immigrant background in Germany live on welfare. Muslim immigrants reject Western values, and they do not socialize with ethnic Germans through friendship and intermarriage, a fact that is covered up by manipulating statistics. Marriages between Arabs with German citizenship and people migrating from Arab countries are presented as intermarriages between Germans and Muslim immigrants, and immigrants with German citizenship are counted as Germans in the crime statistics. What is integration, Abdel-Samad asks. Is it just access to the language, education and work? Is someone integrated here in Germany who is supporting Erdogan, i.e. who is helping a dictator to suppress the free media in his country? The authorities expect the immigrants to learn German, that's all. Abdel-Samad calls this attitude a racism of lowered expectations. Integration requires identifying with the culture in the country in which you live. It presupposes building emotional ties to the country and a conception of democracy which connects all of us. But many Arabic and Turkish immigrants do not develop such ties, and there is a strong moral contempt of the West and of Westerners. Islamism is a culture of intimidation. It's an inferiority complex, and at the same time it's a feeling of superiority towards the world, dividing it into good and evil, believers and non-believers. It's the dream of world domination, the glorification of violence and fantasies of extermination. It's poisoning one's own people through hate and by dehumanization of one's opponents. The Arabic world is infected through and through with anti-Semitism, in school books, political discourses, fiction and the media. Hitler's Mein Kampf is a bestseller in all Arabic countries and has been for decades. Utopias lead to dictatorships, and everywhere where Islamists come into power, the government failed, in Iraq, Syria, Somalia, Sudan, Afghanistan, etc. Abdel-Samad questions the distinction between Islam and Islamism. In Arabic and Turkish, there is no word for Islamism, and Islam was a political movement right from the start. In the Quran, God is presented as the lawgiver, not humans. Sharia is to be the foundation for the law, and this has been a demand within Islam from the beginning. Muhammad was a political leader for 23 years, as well as a general, secretary of treasury, lawgiver, and head of police. The demand for political power is inherent in Islam, and there can be no criticism either of the Prophet or of the Quran. In Germany, radical Islam is on the rise. The number of Salafists is doubled every few years. Saudi Arabia is the biggest sponsor of international terrorism, but terrorists also come from countries like Tunisia and Morocco, and nowadays also from Germany and Austria, and some of them are educated. The founder of the ISIS holds a PhD in Islamic science. Through their activities, Islamists are poisoning young Muslims in Europe with their Salafist Wahhabite ideology. Already today, 45% of all Muslims living in Europe regard the West as their enemy, and they want European law to build on Sharia. Many Muslims believe in and hope for an Islamist victory. The third generation of Muslims in Germany is less integrated than the first and second generations, Abdel-Samad says. The longer Turkish Muslims live in Germany, the stronger they identify with Turkey, and the less with Germany. Erdogan has more support among Turks living here in Germany than in Turkey itself, although his politics is undemocratic. He wants to recreate the Ottoman Empire, which is to replace Europe. How is it possible to integrate into a society which you despise morally and which you want to be taken over by Erdogan's new realm? There is a victim culture in Germany where each group claims to be the biggest victim. People constantly expect and demand things from others, but not from themselves and their own group. Left-wing refugee helpers in Germany strengthen this victim mentality by telling the refugees that Germany has exploited their home countries. The government spends billions of euros on immigration every year, although German families, who are Germany's future, find it increasingly difficult to cope financially. The Muslim Central Council in Germany represents just 1% of the Muslims living in this country. After September 11th, the German government needed someone to talk to, but there are no spiritual communities in Islam corresponding to Christian churches. There is no pope, etc. The Muslim associations in Germany have no theology of their own and no religious seminar, with the exception of the Salafists. They have their own theology and they are multi-ethnic. Religion is the only thing that binds them together. The other Muslim organizations in Germany are no religious organizations, but ethnic national associations, Turkish, Bosnian, etc. They consist of people with no theological or educational competence. A businessman, the owner of a grocery store, and a school teacher come together and found a Turkish association, and this association builds a mosque. The association then is allowed to decide how Islam is to be taught at universities, because it hides behind the name of religious organization. These quasi-religious organizations demand the right to open Islamic nursery schools and Islamic schools because the churches have that right, and they receive a lot of financial support from the German government. By financing Muslim organizations and the Islam Conference, the government is supporting institutions who are actively working against integration and supporting a growing Erdogan cult. There are 3,000 mosques in Germany. They do not teach the Quran historically critically, and they tell young Muslims that they are not allowed to live like Westerners. Before there were mosques in Germany, integration worked much better, but politicians do not have the courage to confess that these institutions are damaging the integration process. Their representatives do not want an open discussion with people like Abdel-Samad or with any other critics. All critical voices have been expelled from the Islam Conference, including Abdel-Samad himself. Today, the Islam Conference is made up of representatives of the Islamic organizations that do not want to talk about any of the problems connected to Islamic teachings. Either the government must take away the status of religious organization from the Muslim associations, or it must take away the right of the churches to run Christian schools, Abdel-Samad says. In Kemalist Turkey, the Islamist groups claimed they wanted to have an equal part in society and that it was important to work together and not against each other, and that their concern was religious education only, not politics. But when Turkey allowed religious schools to open again, indoctrination began anew. These children grew up and went into the justice system, the police force, the army, and the education system. Now, Germany is experiencing the very same development. The Muslim organizations want to be part of the country on equal terms, which means that they want political power. That is the reason why they unite. They control and indoctrinate the Muslim population through religious teachings at schools, and they want to found welfare associations through which they hope to control elderly Muslims, and for this they demand financial support from the government. They claim it should be considered discrimination if a female teacher or judge is not allowed to wear the hijab. Naive feminists celebrate the hijab as a sign of emancipation, but this campaign was actually started by the Muslim Brotherhood in the US, of which they are probably not aware. The same theology which orders a woman to wear the hijab prohibits her from becoming a judge. Women in Islamic countries are not even allowed to appear alone in court. They must be accompanied by another woman, quote, if she forgets, according to the Quran. Today, political Islam increases its influence on European Muslims in religious classes at schools and in the education of new imams, and Abdel-Samad demands that the German government be watchful of this development. Islamists like Salafists and the Muslim Brotherhood practice taqiyya, which means denial of religious beliefs and practices in the face of persecution. In other words, lying to further the cause of Islam in countries where Muslims are not in the majority. Most Muslims in Berlin attend a Salafist mosque. There are immigration parties in Germany, Austria, Belgium and Holland, and the time will come when they will be used by Islamists to put pressure on the government. Here in Germany, Muslim school children often refuse to accept female teachers because they are women, and they reject male teachers because these are non-Muslims. German school teachers come to Abdel-Samad and tell him that they are afraid to talk about Islam in class because the Muslim pupils react very negatively, their parents get involved, and then the school board, and in the end the teachers are told not to talk about Islam in class. But we cannot allow ourselves to fear to talk about identity and about values, Abdel-Samad says. How will we be able to leave Cologne, Berlin, Nice, Brussels, etc. behind if we are not allowed to talk about what happened? But if we try, we are silenced at once with accusations of Islamophobia, racism or Nazism. The schools which should inspire and protect such discourses destroy critical thinking instead of supporting it. Abdel-Samad visited Hamburg in 2014 to speak at the Technical University there, but the event was cancelled with short notice because Islamist students protested against it, which is proof of the fact that the German universities do not protect freedom of speech. In the Arabic world, people have come much further than we in Germany, he says. Today, many women in Egypt reject the hijab. Abdel-Samad compares the Muslim immigrants to the Vietnamese living in Germany. Vietnamese immigrants do not reject German society, although they too face difficulties like racism and poverty. In spite of these problems, they perform better at schools than German children and much better than Muslim children. It's not a question of social class, Abdel-Samad says. The Vietnamese too come from poor regions, and poverty does not make you a terrorist. There is terrible poverty in parts of South America, but it doesn't make these people terrorists. It's a question of culture. Terrorism is based on an ideology. The Vietnamese do not view their own native culture as being morally supreme to Western culture. They do not dream of replacing Western culture with their own, and they demand no exclusive rights. Only Muslims behead other people because Muhammad did so. There are no-go areas in German ghettos where the police do not enter, Abdel-Samad says. In the refugee accommodations there is great frustration. People come to this country with great hopes, which are not fulfilled. They form gangs and frustration turns into violence. The politicians have no plan how to deal with Islamism, criminal extended Arabic families, mafia structures, dreams of recreating an Ottoman Empire on European soil, Turkish banks, the radicalization of German Muslims, or segregation in German society. There are 12,000 registered right-wing radicals in this country and 19,000 grey wolves, right-wing radical Turks. The German government has no problem with the grey wolves, but they have a problem with people like Abdel-Samad. The state must take back its monopoly on violence in this country, he says, and they must destroy the Arabic mafia structures and political Islam like Salafist organizations. Freedom of religion does not mean that you can do anything you want in the name of religion. Sharia is part of Islam, but Sharia has no place in Europe. Abdel-Samad accepts Islam as a private faith, but not as a political force. Political Islam is a threat to world peace, he says. The Muslims living here must distance themselves from parts of their culture which are aimed against Western values, like the views on freedom, sexuality, women's rights, and upbringing. But there is no internal Islamic intellectual debate about secularization in this country. Handing out German citizenship to everyone is insane, because many of the asylum seekers are war refugees, and we must prepare the asylum seekers for the fact that they will have to return to their home countries when the war is over. Most of these people want to stay because there is no future in their own country, not because the war will never end. There are immigrants, including so-called refugees, who go back to their own countries on holiday, after which they return to Germany. Abdel-Samad talks of a demographic bomb in the Islamic world. Almost 70% of all Muslims worldwide are under the age of 30, and half of them are unemployed. He calls for a law for immigration which will define who is a refugee. The formulation of human rights in the German constitution must be developed to express priorities. The right to autonomy, freedom of speech and personal development, as well as equal rights of men and women, must take priority over freedom of religion, as must animal rights. Such a modified constitution will clearly condemn things like child marriage, polygamy, and the ritual killing of animals. Today, advertising chewing gum to children under 10 years of age is prohibited in Germany, and at the same time, Muslim children are being indoctrinated in nursery schools and in mosques, he says. There is no future without a past, according to Abdel-Samad, and he informs us that the opposite of the word for future in German, Zukunft, is not Vergangenheit, but Herkunft, which means not just the past, but where you are from. These include your ancestors. According to Abdel-Samad, we need a guiding culture, in German Leitkultur. This notion was coined by Michael Klonowski, advisor to Alexander Gauland, head of the AfD. The German press rejects the idea of a guiding culture at the same time as they are printing leading articles, he says.